Clueless, absolutely clueless I was. Didn't even have an inkling, and I would have continued to have lived in ignorance if it hadn't been for that blasted leaking factory roof. I loved that amazing woman, my wife Pat, and I would have given my life for her in a heartbeat if I had to. And to have our life together ended in such a cliché, well, the heartbreak was almost unbearable. Oh, I'm Nigel, by the way. Nigel Billings, just your average guy, medium height, medium build, pretty well unremarkable in every way. I don't do anything smart, I'm just a cog in the wheel. I worked in a printing factory all week on a graveyard shift 3 p.m. to half past midnight, Tuesday to Friday. A normal life for a normal guy. I didn't think my whole life was all a lie and that it would collapse so quickly around my sticky-out ears. But there you go. What do we know what's going on around us until it hits us between the eyes? So that was me, ordinary man. What about my wife, Pat? She's so much more than better than average, my wife of 25 years. In fact, she's a walking dream, always has been, and still is. Don't ask me how I landed her in the first place, because I'm totally clueless, right? Tall, at 5'8", she's already an inch taller than me, and when she wears killer heels, she towers over me. But I got over that little complex while we were still dating. It was never an issue all the while she was on my arm. I reveled in showing her off. Blue-eyed and blonde, beautiful, goes without saying, although at 45 years of age, her blonde locks do now have the fortnightly assistance of the colorist at Marlene's hairdressing salon in the village. To some, her slim figure might be regarded as a little too flat-chested, but to someone who appreciates a toned physique, her tight buns and long, slim, shapely legs are absolutely amazing. As for her small body, well, they managed to raise our 3 kids without any complaints from them, and with her regular fitness ritual of 3 2-hour sessions a week at the gym, they are still perky above a flat stomach and are a perfect handful for me. Why would you need any more? As far as anyone was concerned, including me at the time, I was one lucky guy and should count my blessings. Oh, I did. Every day I thanked my lucky stars, until the night of that unfortunate leaking factory roof. Then the sky was so overcast you couldn't see any stars at all, whether they were lucky ones or not. It was a year ago to the day that the incident that completely ruined my life happened. I guess the consequences of that night affected a number of people's lives, but I'm selfish enough to ignore everyone else in this. I know that I lost out big time and don't really care about what it meant to anyone else. Fine, I do admit that others suffered and are still suffering from the aftermath, and I guess if I am honest, the majority of the resulting events are pretty much because of my actions at the time. But do I care? Of course I don't. Why should I? They don't care about me. No, not one of them. Where do I begin? Well, I suppose I better start with the fire. Of course it was old Jack Grafton's fault. The stingy old grump and his incompetent son Jack Jr. only made the problem worse. The roof of the 60-year-old building in which we worked had always leaked, and every time it rained heavily, we had to place up to a dozen plastic bins to catch not just the drips, but in some places a constant stream of dirty rust-contaminated rainwater. The Grafton Graphics owners were tight with their money, and instead of replacing the entire roof, which it really needed, they just patched up the worst parts from time to time. All that did was move the leaks further along the roof, giving the disadvantage of not being able to predict each time where all the drips, or what often turned out as streams, would end up. The night of the fire was a wet, thundery autumn night, when it poured down like crazy for about 45 minutes. At the far end of the building, where I worked alone in the plate room, I only had a single leak. The stain on the wall showed its regular path. I didn't need a bin for this one, as it just streamed down the wall to puddle on the floor. As usual, I simply threw some rags down to soak it up and prevent it from reaching the walkway where it would have been a slippery hazard. I continued to work and run sets of printing plates as I was unaffected by that particular leak. Then, about 25 minutes after the thunderstorm started, the lights in the plate room flickered before the room was plunged into darkness and all the machinery stopped working. The green emergency exit lights came on within a matter of seconds, but the backup generator simply failed to start. The street lights were still on outside, so it was clearly an issue isolated to our old building. I grabbed my coat and bag from next to the doorway and left the room through the internal door and walked down a short corridor. When I entered the factory doors, it was clear that we had serious problems. The place was filled with black smoke and the sprinklers were on. That was a total disaster in any printing works. I quickly went back into the plate room and out through the nearest emergency exit at the back of the factory. I made my way to the evacuation meeting point in front of the building through a continuing heavy rainfall. Toby Mullins, the assistant night manager, was in charge this Friday night and checked off everyone from his increasingly damp list. Looked like I was the last one out, but you guessed it anyway, didn't you? Because he then announced that all were present and correct. I liked Toby. He was young and ambitious but fair and always appreciative. Toby asked rather than ordered people to do things, and people generally responded positively. One thing he knew how to do was make decisions. Right, we are all present and accounted for. The fire service are on their way. Can we get these cars moved from the front car park? Otherwise they'll be blocked in. A few people groaned as they realized their keys were still inside, securely inaccessible in their lockers. I was parked around the back near the car park exit, so I had no problem. A few of us, me included, cheerfully jingled our keys, to the groans of those trapped with their keys and coats still in their changing lockers. The leak found its way into the electrical box for the 5-color press, continued Toby, and the explosion blew the door off. The sparks ignited the nearby dirty rag bin full of ink solvents, which then spread to the press. So, we are probably out of action for the rest of the night. Once the firefighters have controlled the fire, the night shift will have to clean up and assess the damage. All the printed work from today and all the paper set out for tomorrow's jobs are going to have to be replaced. It's clear that no printing will continue until late morning Saturday at the earliest, possibly not until Monday. We could hear the sirens from at least a couple of fire engines which made their way up the bypass. As a few guys who had their car keys on them hurried to move their cars, Toby approached me. As it is an electrical problem, once the fire is controlled, the Sparks engineer will have to check the box and fix it, possibly replace it. They have a 2-hour response time before they even show up, and you finish in less than 3 hours, so you might as well head home now. The plate room was the only production department on a 2-shift system. Everyone else was on 3 shifts. If a plate went blind on the press between midnight and 6 in the morning, the machine minders would have to make it themselves. I told Toby what he probably already knew, that there were plates running through the processor, which would have to be removed and discarded, and probably all the chemicals cleaned out and replenished before restarting the plating process. That would take up half of the next plate-making shift. He did express his frustration. We both knew we would have to remake all the plates on the seized-up presses, as well as produce new plates for all the ruined print work from the last few days, all part of the accumulating costs of not spending a few timely pounds on the defective roof. So I hurried off to move my car out of the way before the firefighters decided to approach the fire from both ends of the building and block my escape. As I drove out of the trading estate, I glanced at the time, not quite 10:30 p.m., over 3 hours early. With any luck, Pat would still be up and maybe in a good mood. Okay, I'm an optimist at heart, so what's wrong with that? As it turned out, I was correct on both counts but failed to benefit from either. To get her in a positive mindset, I stopped off at the all-night supermarket just off the bypass and picked up a bottle of wine, some chocolates, and a bouquet of flowers, roses I think they were. Hey, I can make an effort on the romantic side when I need to. As I pulled into my road, which is in the shape of a crescent, a quiet road with an opening at each end, I noticed a bright red Porsche reverse out of my drive ahead of me and speed away up the road. I instantly recognized the car. It belonged to Reggie Nicholson, Pat's boss. He had bought the nearly new sports car that March or April and had invited everyone he knew to an unseasonably cool Sunday barbecue to show off his flashy car. I had the sinking feeling it wasn't just the car he'd been showing off tonight. Patricia Bellows was a secretary in the office at the factory where I worked at the time I first met her, about 28 years ago. It was not a great start to our long relationship, as I originally went up to the office to complain to the wages clerk about messing up my overtime pay for the previous week. We got paid on a Thursday night in those days, with envelopes of money and a payslip. Once we got paid, my friends and I would go to the nearest pub for a few drinks and games before heading home. That was my simple Thursday night routine each week. Those were the days. I was 23 at the time and a printer, just 2 years out of my apprenticeship, and with 7 years' experience behind me. Checking my payslip over my first drink at the pub, I realized that I hadn't been paid for a Saturday morning's overtime, which meant I was missing a significant amount of money. I was disappointed because I had planned to use that money for my weekend expenses. I always used to be optimistic, but that was starting to change. Any work on Saturday was typically paid the following Thursday. So on Friday morning at 9 o'clock, when the office staff finally arrived to reluctantly start their last day of the week, I went up to the wages office and expressed my frustration about the missing overtime pay to Polly Campbell. Polly calmly said she would investigate the issue and come to see me in the press room later in the day. As I turned to leave, I accidentally bumped into a new girl I had never seen before. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, one for Polly, and the collision caused the coffee to spill on her dress. I immediately apologized and offered to pay for the dry cleaning. She was very gracious about it and kindly said that it would wash out. She had a friendly smile, and I instantly took a liking to her. It wasn't until she went to get more coffee that I had the chance to appreciate her attractive figure. I followed up my apology by catching up with her at the drinks dispenser and asking her if she wanted to have dinner together. She was young and shy and blushed when she politely declined. I was disappointed, thinking she probably already had someone interested in her. But I couldn't blame anyone. She was very beautiful. When Polly finally caught up with me later, I was working on my printing press. She gave me a new payslip and the cash I was owed for the overtime. I asked Polly about the new girl, curious to know more. Pollyanna was a talkative married woman with young children. She had recently returned to work full-time. Polly was platinum blonde and tended to wear short skirts. She made up for whatever was lacking in the new girl with her chest. It was always entertaining for the whole press room to catch a glimpse of Polly. My colleagues were already gathering around to enjoy the view. Luckily, the noise in the press room made it hard to have a conversation, so I leaned closer to Polly to ask about the new girl, nearly overwhelmed by her strong perfume. Polly smiled at my interest in the new girl and was willing to share the little information she had. I found out that her name was Pat. She was only 18, had just finished secretarial college, and she didn't seem to have a boyfriend. She had only been working in the company for 5 days and hadn't explored beyond the general office yet. Polly thought I might have a good chance with her, as Pat had asked who I was after I had left. I thanked Polly and asked if she could find a reason to send Pat down to see me in the press room. Polly laughed, saying that she could probably find multiple reasons due to my messy handwriting on my timesheets. Good old Polly. I still see her around town nowadays. She enjoys a drink, but she has let herself go a bit. She had an affair with a man in the bindery a couple of years after I met Pat, which resulted in the end of her marriage and losing her home and alienating her children. It's sad, and I feel sorry for her even though we're in similar situations now. Sure enough, Pat was sent down to find me later that day. Luckily, the press was idle when she arrived, as I was cleaning it between jobs. I asked her if she had a chance to explore the factory yet. She had been shown around during her second job interview by Joan, the office manager. But by the time Pat started, everyone who knew their way around the factory had already gone home. The factory worked from 8 to 4:30, and the office hours were an hour later, from 9 to 5:30. So I took the opportunity to show Pat around, aware that my friends would tease me later. When we reached the quieter paper store at the end of the factory, I finally mustered the courage to ask her out to dinner. She blushed and said she would think about it. Just before we reached the big doors to the binding department, she surprised me by saying yes. We stopped there, and I hastily found a pencil and piece of paper to write down her contact information. We agreed to meet that very night at 7, and she walked away on her high heels, giving me the best view of a girl leaving that I had seen in a long time. I had to sneak into the foreman's office to make a call to the restaurant and secure a table for 2. Luckily, they had availability. I was thrilled. I checked my finances and realized I didn't have enough money for the expensive meal. I used to save some money each week, but I would have to borrow from my mom until I could go to the building society and withdraw enough to pay her back. My mom could tell that I was smitten with this girl, so she agreed to lend me the money. I wanted to make a good impression, so I took my bath on Friday night and put on my best suit, my only suit actually. I didn't think about what we would do on our second date, or if there even would be one. I went all out for that first night. I had noticed where she lived on my way home from the factory, so I could easily find her place in the dark. There was no GPS navigation back then. It's amazing how we managed without it. We came from different backgrounds, Pat and I. I came from a working-class family, and she worked in the office. Her parents were middle class and owned a sweet shop in the high street, while my dad worked in a factory. I lived with my parents in a rented house in a council estate, while Pat's parents had a nicer home. Their backyard had a gazebo and well-maintained lawns, while our backyard was just concrete with my dad's pigeon loft. They even had a village green with a duck pond. The only grass around our neighborhood grew through the cracks in the pavement. I was scheduled to pick Pat up at 7. Of course, she wasn't ready, so I was shown into their living room, where I waited for about 10 minutes, entertained by her little sister, Eveline. Now, Evie always had a way of making people feel uncomfortable. Even back then, when she was only 12, she would ask me embarrassing questions like if I had kissed Pat yet, or where we were going for dinner. She seemed interested in our date and wanted to know when we would be back and when we would go out again. She even pointed out that I had ears that stuck out, as if I didn't already know. I felt like I had heard enough questions to last a lifetime. Evie and I have always had a playful relationship over the years, with no serious intentions. She still has that same earnestness, though. Pat once said that Evie had a crush on me when she was younger, but I never saw it. When Pat finally entered the cozy living room, it felt like the entire room disappeared, and it was just the two of us in a grand ballroom. I felt like I could dance from here to the moon, even though I couldn't dance at all. I was the original wallflower. But when I walked out of that beautiful house with Pat on my arm, it felt like I had wings. That is, until we reached my old beat-up car. I kept forgetting that the passenger door was difficult to open. I never used that door myself, only my friends did when we went to watch the match. I struggled and cursed, then went to the driver's side and used all my strength to open it from the inside. My football friends are all strong guys, so I usually don't have to worry about opening the door for them. They probably have a trick for opening it that I haven't bothered to learn. It hadn't been a problem until now because my mom would never be caught dead in my old car. I apologized to Pat for my car and for swearing. Pat, bless her, just smiled sweetly. Le Clipper was a fancy restaurant on the London Road that used to be near the bypass. It's gone now and has been replaced by a modern and busy square motel made of steel and glass. The restaurant changed owners many times since it first started as a coaching inn 150 years ago. When I'm talking about it, the restaurant had just been renamed and served a mostly English-French menu. We were led to our table by a snobby waiter who noticed that my ill-fitting suit was a cheap one from the previous year's January sales, while Pat's elegant chiffon dress was from this season's collection in a boutique in a fancy city far from this lifeless industrial town. He seated Pat with a fancy gesture at our not-so-intimate table for two in the middle of the restaurant, giving her a charming smile. Then he pulled the chair out for me to sit down, and it felt like he pushed the chair into the back of my legs, causing me to plop down into the seat like a rag doll. If this were a different type of place, I would have argued with the rude waiter. To be honest, I was a bit overwhelmed by the fancy atmosphere. This may have been the first time that I felt out of my element with Patricia Bellows, but it certainly wasn't the last. At the time, I wasn't aware of that. The waiter for our table was called over by the rude waiter, and he brought us the menus, giving one to Pat first, of course. Then another waiter brought us the wine list and gave it to me. The first waiter lit the candle in the middle of the table and stepped away so we could make our choices. The wine waiter, however, stood near my shoulder. I resisted the urge to order a pint of beer, especially after seeing the price of a half pint, which was way more expensive than a full pint at my local pub. Pat was still reading the menu when I politely asked her if it was all right to have a carafe of the house wine. She looked up and smiled, saying yes. After a bit more prodding, she chose white wine, so I was able to get rid of the wine waiter. They must charge so much in these places because they have too many staff. I don't remember what we ordered back then, but I think Pat had the roast chicken with creamy French sauce, and I probably had a well-done steak with a side of Coleman's mustard. What I do remember is that while I was holding the menu, which was filled with fancy French words that I struggled to understand, I accidentally held the top of it over the candle flame. I didn't realize it because I was focused on the small print at the bottom, searching for a side of fries and beans, until the menu caught fire. Pat yelled first. I think she said fire, but she might have said something else. She learned a wide range of words in her finishing school. I definitely swore. Those laminated menus ignited like fireworks. I dropped the menu, knocking over the candle and setting the lace doily on fire. The wine waiter arrived at that moment with our carafe of wine. I grabbed it and poured half of it over the flames. What a mess that caused. The rude waiter, who already looked down on my taste in clothes while openly admiring Pat's appearance, glared at me as if I were the lowest of the low. He cleared the table and came back with fresh tablecloth, cutlery, glasses, and new menus. But no candle. I was too embarrassed to say anything smart, which was a first for me. I told you I felt overwhelmed. Most of the other diners found the incident amusing, and a couple of guys sympathetically admitted that they had come close to doing the same thing, which made me feel better. Meanwhile, Pat thought the whole thing was hilarious and it helped break the ice between us. She tried hard not to laugh too much but couldn't help it. She looked gorgeous when she laughed. I just hoped I would have more opportunities to make her laugh intentionally in the future. The rest of the meal went well, we both enjoyed it. Afterward, I took her to a pub with a nice lounge bar for another drink. It was packed with people on a Friday night, so we managed to find a small corner to sit in. I put my arm around her, partly for protection. By that time, I think she had let go of her shyness with me and kept laughing every time someone lit a cigarette with a lighter or matches. I didn't mind. The crowded bar meant we were close together, and her laughter meant she leaned against me even more. I had no complaints. When we left the pub, we walked arm in arm back to the car, which I had parked in a free lot near New Street. It was a little out of the way, so it was quiet and dark. I opened her door with a firm pull and let her in. Then I got in on my side, and as soon as I sat down, Pat practically hugged me. She wrapped her arms around my neck. When she took a moment to catch her breath, I said, "Save some of that for the future, Pat." That stopped her. It took a couple of moments before she spoke very softly and uncertainly. "You're pretty confident, aren't you, Nigel? Anything but confident about where we'll end up, Pat. But I want to be in it for the long run, not just a quick hello and goodbye." "What makes you think you'll be that lucky?" "Well, it seems like we're getting along well, but I expected that in the next few weeks it would be you slowing things down. I was planning on taking it slow. So this is new territory for me." "So you want to take things slow, at least get to know each other better, before—" "Oh, I'm not inexperienced. If that's what you're worried about, neither am I." I looked at her lovely face in the moonlight. "I still want to spend more time with you and get to know you better." "Are you okay with that?" "Sure, Nige. I'm fine with that." She still had her arms around my neck and slowly moved her lips back to mine. We hugged gently for a while, with her stroking the back of my head while I stroked her back. When we had enough of hugging, she rested against me and buried her head in my chest, sighing. We sat there comfortably for a few minutes, not saying anything. I continued stroking her back while she rested her hands on my shoulders. Then Pat sighed again and stirred. "What about tomorrow?" she asked. "What about tomorrow? What are we doing tomorrow? I usually have a busy day planned for most Saturdays." "Well, what did you have planned before you met me today?" "Working in the morning from 8 to 12, then going home for lunch and changing for football in the afternoon. I usually get home around 6 and then go to the football social club in the evening. They usually have entertainment like a comedian and a band on Saturday nights." "Want to come?" "I don't usually wake up until noon on Saturdays. Then I need to wash my hair." "What time will you pick me up in the evening?" 7:30. Sounds good to me, Nige. I guess you should get me home now. I bet my mom is waiting up for me." All right, we had another sweet hug, with me happily touching her back, before we ended it, and I started the old car. I had to wipe off the condensation from the inside of the windows before we could see where we were going, and I drove her home. I jumped out of the car and opened the door for her. We stopped on the porch and shared a quick warm hug. I gently placed my hand on her backside and she didn't mind. Pat turned out to be more outgoing than I initially thought. "See you tomorrow, Nige. See you then." Pat during the tea break at work on Saturday morning. I met old Jerry, the maintenance guy, in the car park. We worked together to fix and grease the door catches. I made sure to clean up any grease afterwards so Pat wouldn't ruin her dress. Jerry sure loves grease. He slathers it on like a clown putting on face paint. Since I couldn't afford to go out on expensive dates like our first one very often, Saturday night was a budget-friendly night at the local football social club. It was a bit rough, but Pat was willing to go there despite being used to more upscale venues like the Conservative Club and Fancy City nightclubs. At work on Monday, we pretended to ignore each other. On Monday nights, she would hang out with her girlfriends from the office. On Tuesday, we decided to go to the new multiplex cinema, sharing a bag of toffee popcorn and holding hands throughout the movie. Pat wasn't getting paid for another 3 weeks, so she was using her savings for now, just like me. Wednesday was my football training night and Thursday was payday, which meant it was my night out with the boys. Then came Friday and Saturday nights, which were our main dates where we would go out to eat, dance, or catch a show. We continued to see each other regularly, and our relationship grew stronger each day. It took almost 3 weeks before she surprised me with another passionate encounter. This time, it happened in the back seat of my car, but we made sure to keep it sweet and PG rated. She was eager and relentless, while I tried to keep us grounded and not take advantage of our intimacy. I honestly thought she would leave after getting what she wanted, but to my surprise, she stuck around and our relationship only grew stronger. We came from different backgrounds, with Pat being middle class and me being blue collar. Back then, class divisions were more pronounced compared to today. I remained on the shop floor throughout my working life, finding comfort in my work. Eventually, I moved to the plate-making department, which came with a significant pay raise. I earned quite a good amount of money for a shop floor worker and had the respect of my colleagues for being skilled and dedicated to my job. Pat, on the other hand, received a great education and pursued a career in the business world. She continued to take management courses and aimed for better positions. We had children over a span of 6 years during her early to mid-20s. With help from our mothers, Pat was able to work consistently, only taking a few months off for each child. She joined the Spinner Group 6 years ago and worked her way up alongside her boss, Reggie Nicholson. They were both promoted multiple times, with Nicholson becoming the sales director and Pat being the senior of 3 sales managers. Pat enjoyed a vibrant social life. She loved dancing, dinner parties, and socializing with different people. She had a wide circle of friends, although I found some of them to be a bit superficial. Unfortunately, most of her friends and even her sister Evie had experienced marital issues like divorces and affairs. Her sales job meant attending numerous dinners, wining and dining clients, and taking them to various events. I had to trust her to behave when I wasn't around, and I had no reason to doubt her loyalty. She made a rule for herself to not drink when we weren't together, ensuring she always stayed in control. I trusted her completely, just as she trusted me. I was a more introverted person compared to Pat. I wasn't a good dancer and didn't enjoy clubbing. I especially disliked dinner parties because of the judgment I felt from the attendees due to my blue-collar job. I preferred beer over wine and rarely drank excessively. My circle of friends remained small, consisting mostly of lifelong friends rather than new acquaintances. It always surprised me how Pat and I ended up together and got married just 2 years into our relationship. The fact that we were still happily married after 28 years was a constant source of amazement. I often reminded myself that I didn't deserve to be in such a great relationship and felt grateful for every moment. That brings us to the night of the leaking factory roof. As I arrived home, I noticed a potential rival for my wife's affections driving away from our house and disappearing around the corner. I parked my car behind Pat's new black BMW, which was provided by the company. Her car was just a week old and filled with the latest gadgets, highlighting her importance to the company. Comparatively, my 8-year-old Ford hatchback only had a heated rear screen. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, gathering my thoughts before going inside. Part of me wanted to follow Nicholson, but I reminded myself that he may have had innocent reasons for being there, such as dropping Pat off after a meeting with clients. I touched the hood of her car, finding it cool to the touch. The rain had subsided, indicating that the car had been parked for at least a couple of hours. Carrying the chocolate, wine, and flowers, I quietly entered the house. The downstairs lights were off, and the rooms were empty. I took off my shoes at the entrance, as Pat insisted on no outdoor shoes inside. Her love for cream-colored carpets meant I often got scolded for dropping coffee or tracking dirt from the garden. I tiptoed into the kitchen, leaving the items I bought there for safekeeping before sneaking upstairs. The master bedroom light was on, and I could hear the sound of the shower running in the ensuite bathroom. The bed was in disarray, with the duvet on the floor and pillows thrown around. Pat's clothes were scattered across the bedroom floor. I examined the bottom sheet and a couple of pillows, which had damp patches that smelled suspiciously like fresh fluid. It was clear that my wife had engaged in unprotected intimacy with someone else in our bed for at least a few hours. These were definitely not my emissions since we had made love on Sunday morning, and the sheets had been changed immediately after. Unaware of my presence, Pat was singing happily in the shower room. The layout of the Ian suite prevented having a bathtub, so there was only a shower, wash basin, and toilet. Additionally, the door opened outward into the bedroom due to lack of space. As quietly as possible, I moved the bed to block the shower door from opening. This meant I couldn't close the bedroom door, so I left it open and wedged the bed at an angle to keep the in-suite door closed. Then I gathered all the bed linens, including the duvet cover, and put them into black refuse bags. I fetched the bags from under the kitchen sink and took them to the car, locking them safely in the trunk as evidence for the divorce. It was fortunate that our children weren't home at the time. Charlie and June were away at university, with Charlie in her second year at Newcastle and June starting her post-grad master's at Manchester. Robert had moved out 3 years prior and was living with his girlfriend across town. With me being away until almost 1 in the morning, Pat had the freedom to do as she pleased in the evenings. I had no clue how long she'd been doing what she clearly just did. I rummaged through the garage for a few things I thought I might need, putting them in the trunk of my car. For a fleeting moment, I considered setting fire to the house, but I knew it would only harm the kids. I also briefly entertained the thought of dragging Pat out of the shower and exposing her on the front lawn. However, those options didn't sit right with me considering the potential impact on our children. I knew where Nicholson lived since we had visited his house in April that year. I didn't know if he parked his sports car outside, on his driveway, or in a garage. Passing his house, I saw the car parked on the driveway. I parked my car around the corner, about 50 meters away, and retrieved a half-full container of white spirit, a small amount of methylated spirits, and a box of matches from my trunk. It was around 11:15, and most houses in the street had lights on in the bedrooms and downstairs. I comforted myself by thinking that I wouldn't disturb too many adults, and it wasn't a school night for the children. The sports car was parked on a slight slope, with another car, likely his wife's, in front of it. I poured methylated spirits on each of the Porsche's tires and white spirit on the car's roof and sides. I struck 2 matches and dropped them near the front and rear wheels. The flames ignited immediately, consuming the tires, paintwork, and eventually reaching the roof. Once the car was well alight, I calmly walked back to my car and drove back home. On the way back, I called Toby on my mobile and asked him a favor. He sounded doubtful but asked what I needed. I informed him about my wife and Nicholson's car. Without needing to be asked, he vouched for me, telling me to hurry back to prove my presence. I returned the bottles, which still contained some liquid, to the garage. I also grabbed an old container of spent engine oil that I had meant to take to the recycling dump. Finally, I let myself back into the house. As I climbed the stairs, I could hear the loud banging and desperate shouting of "let me out" coming from the shower room. I walked through the house with my shoes on, stepping on her pristine cream-colored carpet. The pile of garbage bags was still there, so I started clearing out all her drawers and wardrobes and stuffing the clothes in, as messy as possible, in the garbage bags, starting with all her fancy designer label clothes that she wears for her good friend Nicholson at work. I dragged the first 3 or 4 bags down to the garage, poured a good measure of thick black oil into each of the bags, and tied them up. I accidentally spilled some of the oil on the garage floor, thinking, clumsy me. I had some muddy old boots stored out there for gardening. I put them on and stepped in the oil, leaving oily, muddy footprints throughout the hall, the stairway, landing, and the master bedroom. I lost count of the number of bags of clothes, but it was a lot, at least 20. I had been thinking about what I was going to do about the bed. There was no way I was ever going to sleep in it again or use any of that bedroom furniture. I had already decided that I would be unable to use Toby's alibi, as only I could have come home and moved Pat's stuff out to the garage. Darn. The size 10 welly footprints were a clear giveaway too. I figured I wouldn't get locked up for any more than 6 months for the arson on Nicholson's car and decided it was worth every single day. I might even get a suspended sentence if any of the 3 magistrates had been divorced from a cheating spouse before. So, after tying up the last bag, I grabbed my 14-pound sledgehammer from its hooked resting place on the wall and took it up to the bedroom. I smashed each bedside cabinet with a couple of satisfying blows of the hammer. The shower room had been quiet for a while. I hadn't noticed until then. Once I started using the hammer, though, the loud screaming started up again. For a moment, I wished that I had an axe instead of a sledgehammer so I could break through one of the panels in the shower room door and recreate the famous scene from The Shining film and really scare Pat for one last time. Without advance notice, you can never really plan these things out properly, can you? I smashed up her dressing table and all the wardrobe doors and destroyed the full-length mirror that she loved so much. I thought that, as I had just discovered I'd had 28 years of bad luck, another 7 was just a stroll in the park. Then I started wrecking the bed. It all went quiet in the shower room as I moved the violence closer to that doorway. I assumed she had fainted in terror or hurt herself. I was past caring by then, quite frankly. I dragged the mattress down the oil-soaked stairs out to the front of the house and dumped it on the lawn. I opened the garage and brought out the last of the oil and poured it all over that mattress. I was just putting the can away on the shelf with my back to the open garage door when I got the fright of my life. Pat's voice immediately behind me angrily shouted, "What the heck is going on here, Nige?" That pretty much brings us up to date. I walked away from Pat without saying a word. I didn't trust myself to be nice. I drove away that night, still in my boots, with just the oil-stained work clothes that I stood up in. I never heard anything from Nicholson, so there was no court case for arson. I did eventually get court papers for the legal separation from Pat, with all our assets frozen until the 2 girls finished their full-time education. I was ordered to continue paying an agreed amount into the joint account for maintaining the house and payment of the mortgage. I wasn't happy about it as it didn't leave me much to live on. I cut my costs by giving up my mobile phone and my car. I was tired of all the messages from Pat, probably saying her affair didn't mean anything or something like it. I never listened to any of them, but I guessed what nonsense they would consist of. I bought a second-hand bicycle to get to work and rented a small one-bed studio flat above a noisy row of shops, basically because it was affordable. I had to change jobs. Grafton Graphics went out of business as the firm wasn't properly insured apparently, and I was laid off, along with everyone else. Finally, after about 3 months of trying, I got a job in a little high-street copy shop, taking orders, designing small print jobs, making paper plates, and printing off using small offset, or even doing a bit of document photocopying. It wasn't much, but it was a job. The kids took their mom's side, naturally, when I called them individually the next day, and they all said they didn't want anything to do with me. They all agreed that I needed to be punished after what I had done. There was no mention of what she had done to me. Maybe I frightened her, but she ruined me. Oddly enough, the only family member I have been in contact with in the past year is Pat's sister Evie. She came into the copy shop one lunchtime about 2 weeks ago, and suddenly we were looking at each other, not quite knowing what to say. She's come by a couple of times since, and each time she's told me that Pat wanted to speak to me. I kept telling her until I was exhausted that I didn't want to speak to the lying, cheating woman or any of her selfish children. Anyway, I pointed out, it was Pat that enforced the legal separation, not me. Evie said that that was all a mistake. They thought they could force me out of wherever I was hiding to face them in court, but I never showed up to contest the court ruling. Anyway, then Evie came in to remind me that it was the first anniversary since what we have both laughingly referred to as the shower room incident. Evie wanted to take me out to a restaurant to celebrate or commiserate. I tried to tell her no, I really didn't want anything more to do with that family, but she refused to listen. She insisted, and I admitted to her that I simply couldn't afford to go out. The separation payments were draining me financially. Okay, I still had my redundancy money, about $8,000, but that was tied up in ISAs, strictly for emergencies only. Evie insisted that she would be paying for the meal, so I reluctantly agreed to go out with her, as long as we went somewhere inexpensive. When she asked why, I admitted it was because I had walked away only with the work clothes I was wearing that night, and I didn't have a suit or even anything nice to wear. What I had picked up from charity shops. She gave me a look of pity and squeezed my arm, making me even more determined to cancel our plans. Still, at the last minute, I remembered Pat mentioning once that Evie had a crush on me when she was younger, so what did I have to lose? I had lost my pride long ago, and I had nothing else left. I had arranged to meet Evie at the restaurant for two reasons. One, I didn't want her to know where I lived in case she told my family. And secondly, I could always leave and bike home if things didn't go well. I suspected that this might be a trap for an ambush by Pat. I don't know why I thought that would happen. Pat and I were legally separated, and she could proceed with the divorce whenever she wanted, most likely after the girls finished university. I was just suspicious of Evie's intentions. Being let down by one woman made me suspicious of them all. Look, as I explained earlier, I am not young. I am just an average person that no one would notice twice. I don't have a girlfriend and haven't had one for years. And honestly, I don't want anything to do with any of them. So why was Evie so interested in going out with me? Even if she had a teenage crush on me almost 30 years ago, she's 11 years younger than me and looks fantastic at 40. I am a jaded 50-plus single man with conspicuously large ears who is accepting becoming a sad and lonely old man who couldn't care less about the rest of the world. I parked my bicycle and locked it to a post on the edge of the parking lot next to a dark wall of the restaurant. I adjusted my trousers and tucked my helmet under my arm before walking into the restaurant. I was earlier than expected, about 10 minutes. Looking around at the tables, I didn't expect to see her yet, but she was there, sitting at a cozy table for two. Maybe that meant I wouldn't be ambushed by Pat after all. Evie looked very attractive, but that didn't change the fact that this was a relationship that wasn't going anywhere. I looked like a mess, and I wasn't really in the mood to have someone sitting across from me who constantly reminded me of her sister, my ex. As I approached the table, Evie saw me and stood up to give me a friendly kiss on the cheek. I placed my helmet under the table. She noticed this and asked, "Didn't bring the car with you tonight? No car at all. Had to give it up. Every cent I have goes to your sister to support her, her lover, and her daughters," I said with bitterness. "Oh, I didn't realize it was that bad." "Well, I lost my job when the factory never reopened after the fire. That meant I was unemployed for 3 months, and as soon as I got another job that pays about half of what I used to earn, your sister filed court orders freezing my assets since the time we got married and demanded more money from me." I retrieved my helmet from under the table and stood up. "Look, I'm too angry to eat. Coming here was a mistake. I have to leave." Evie stood up and took hold of my hand. "Please don't go, Nigel. I really wanted to talk to you. You look so thin and tired. You need some good food. Can you stay?" she asked. Evie reminded me of that little 12-year-old girl she used to be. I couldn't resist her, especially since I was tired of eating beans on toast at my apartment. "All right," I agreed. I'm easily swayed. Maybe I just needed a break from my monotonous diet. I didn't have many friends, so why not? Evie ordered a pint of lager for me and a fruity mocktail for herself. She already had one earlier. She ordered a mixed grill, while I went for a big juicy steak, fries, and mushrooms. I wasn't even sure if I was hungry, but I couldn't pass up this opportunity to treat myself. Evie could afford it, after all. As we waited for our food, something strange happened. A woman approached our table. She was quite attractive, dressed smartly, though maybe a bit overdressed for this place. She seemed a bit confident, maybe even a bit flashy. I would guess she was in her mid to late 30s, with shoulder-length dark hair. She stopped by our table and stood next to me. "Excuse me," she said nervously. She glanced at Evie for a moment, then looked back at me. "Have we met before?" I noticed she wasn't wearing any rings on her left hand as I stood up. She was slightly shorter than me, petite but with a noticeable figure. It seemed like she got even more nervous when I stood up. I can't help it. I always stand up when someone addresses me. "I don't think so," I tried to smile, to put her at ease. "If we had met before, I'm sure I would have remembered someone as attractive as you, and you don't hold any grudge against me, no, not at all. Like I said, I don't even know you. We've never met before." My smile faded. This evening was turning out to be quite strange. She smiled at my response and extended her right hand. "I'm Janet. It's nice to meet you," she said. "I'm Nigel. Pleasure to meet you." We shook hands, and then she said thank you and walked away. I watched her go until she exited the establishment. I sat back down, feeling bewildered. "That was odd," I commented. "Do you know her?" "Yes," Evie replied after a slight pause. "She went through a difficult time last year and has been in therapy since then. I was hoping you could help her, and maybe she could support you too. or at least lift your spirits. I looked at Evie. Why do the women in your life always try to manipulate you, using you for their own purposes? In this case, to help someone struggling with their confidence. I used to be happy without a woman in my life. Why can't they just leave well enough alone? Probably because they're curious, a realist might suggest, or because they're women, a cynic would say. I knew which camp I belonged to, and it had been that way for a year now. What other surprises do you have planned for me during this dinner? Evie, nothing. Nigel, I promise. I just want us to enjoy the meal and have a nice conversation. I'm happy to chat about anything except my failed marriage or your sister and her family. Okay. Of course, Evie agreed. So, where are you living now? Nigel, I'm renting a small studio apartment. I'd rather not say where exactly. Is it comfortable? Nige. No, it's cold, damp, and noisy. It's not in the nicest part of town, and there are always groups of young people hanging around outside. I have to bring my bike inside my room to keep it safe. If you want, I could talk to Pat about adjusting the financial conditions of our separation. No, it's almost over anyway. Just another year or so until Junie finishes her master's. I assume Charlie got her degree, as the payments to Pat went down a couple of months ago. Oh yes, she graduated with honors. I went to Newcastle with Pat for the graduation ceremony. It was lovely, Evie said. Charlie was quite upset that you weren't there to see her. I can imagine. Charlie gave me an earful when I called her last year, and she said she never wanted to speak to me again. I said bitterly. That's because she didn't know the whole story. She knows now, I think. She sent you the invitations by email, but she never heard back. She seems to have easily forgiven Pat for what she did. If Pat was invited, I said. Anyway, I don't receive emails anymore. I had to give up my mobile phone, and my laptop is still at Pat's. Charlie decided to stay in Newcastle. She found a job there, and most of her friends are also in that area now. That's great. I wish her all the best. I'll let her know when I see her. Then the waiter appeared with our main meals, spending a minute or two setting out our plates and fetching me some mustard and ketchup plus a steak knife. So we settled down to eat. Once I started eating, my appetite discovered me in that state of malnutrition that I'd found myself in for months, and I actually made rather short work of it, even eating the side salad for once. Evie ordered a top-up of drinks, so I decided to have a second lager. By the end of the main course, I felt quite relaxed and decided to ask Evie how she was. Even when you try your hardest, a negative bullshit attitude is difficult to maintain after a couple of pints and a steak dinner at someone else's expense. Maybe that's why some girls become more open on a first date. I'm okay, thank you, she smiled. Still working at the same place, and there's been no significant other in my life since the last divorce. Same old, really. What about you, romance-wise? Nothing. I have a problem with trust issues. Natural, I guess. After a long relationship goes sour, there was a pause in the conversation. You've not asked me about Pat's love life. That's because I'm not interested, I replied, truthfully, and I believe we agreed not to speak of her. You are still hurting, though. You are still hurting, though. No, not really. Not about my marriage as such. I think that I have accepted that it was probably over a long time before Muffins here realized it. If we get divorced anytime soon, I don't think I will shed any more tears over it. Okay, I am a little depressed about my living and working circumstances, but on the other hand, I quite like being on my own and not having to worry about getting dirt on Pat's carpets. I actually smiled thinking about those carpets. She hated what you did to those carpets. I interrupted her by laughing out loud and clapping my hands together. She had them steam cleaned and still didn't get all the stains out. She ended up having to replace the hall, stairs, and landing carpets. Evie was chuckling as well at the thought. What color are they now? I asked. A dark gray, sort of mottled. I couldn't help it. I had to get out my handkerchief again. My eyes were streaming. My third pint of lager arrived then, and we ordered ice cream for afters. Then followed coffee and brandy, I should say several brandies. We did chat, but not about anything in particular, or nothing that registered with me really. I was starting to get a nice buzz. It was then that she dropped the $64,000 question. Do you want the evening to continue? I'd like you to come back to my place for a nightcap. Would you come? I hesitated. Actually, the evening had gone very well and I was starting to enjoy it. I hadn't been out socially anywhere for a year. I did miss company. I also really missed female company. However, Evie was much too close to home. I wanted to get away from all that. I hate complications. Sorry, Evie, I need to get home. I've got to go to work tomorrow. Besides, I don't want any complications in my life right now. Please, Nigel, I cannot drive anyway because I have drunk too much, so I need to get a cab. Please come back with me just for an hour or so. We can have a coffee or two, and then I will arrange for you to have a lift home. No funny business on my part, I promise you. There's no point in this, Evie. I care for you, of course you are a beautiful woman, but I regard you just like a sister. We will never be any more than that. Wait here, she said. I'll just go ring for a lift and we'll discuss it further when I get back. I twiddled my thumbs for a while after she left. The waitress came to clear the coffee cups and glasses. I ordered another couple of brandies and asked her for the bill. Still no sign of Evie. I got the feeling she had done a runner and left me to settle the bill. Bugger, I thought. It may be a cheap restaurant, but I bet the bill was up to about 70 euros, and I didn't have anywhere near that much cash on me. The brandies and the bill turned up together. It was over 80 euros. Darn, I might have to do the washing up for them for the next fortnight if Evie's done a runner. I've definitely had it up to here with the Bellows family. I slowly drank my brandy, spending an appropriate amount of time warming it in my hand, swirling round the liquor, breathing in those heavenly fumes. Still no sign of Evie, so after I finished mine, I grabbed her brandy and warmed that up in my hand. The waitress looking after our table hovered about and walked past several times, probably wondering why I was left on my own and had not settled the bill yet. I was thinking the exact same thing and wondering how long it was to go before closing time. I must have been there all on my lonesome for what seemed like at least 20 minutes, and then Evie finally came back, somewhat to my relief, which must have been betrayed in my face. "Miss me, honey?" she asked. Thought I was going to have to do the washing up, and I left my favorite set of marigolds on my drainer at home, I replied. Sorry, I was just sorting out my ride. Still room for you to come along too, if you've changed your mind, of course. No, I replied. Maybe another time when I feel a little more sociable, in say, a couple of years' time. The waitress brought over the credit card machine and Evie settled the bill, to my relief. After the waitress had run out the sale receipt for her and moved away, Evie smiled at me. Ready, 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 I reached down and grabbed my helmet. We walked out of the restaurant arm in arm, with me thanking Evie for treating me to the meal and promised to return the favor when Junie finally finished her extended education and I was released from my financial commitment, provided she didn't decide to go for a professorship. When we reached the exit, I asked Evie when a ride would arrive, and she said they were already here and she would just wait where she was for them to drive around the parking lot. So I kissed her goodbye on the cheek, and she asked me not to lose contact with her. I reminded her where she would find me at work if she wanted to contact me. I walked around the corner to the side of the restaurant where they had the bike rack. It was dark around there, and a couple of people were standing immediately in front of my bike, a man and a woman, well wrapped up against the chilly night. I didn't look at them closely as I was putting on my helmet and tying up the strap, but as I passed them, the woman spoke to me. "Nige, can I have a word?" she said. I froze. I hadn't heard that voice for exactly 12 months. I might have known. "Little sis called you and stalled me to give you enough time to get here." "Yes, we were waiting at her house for you both to go round for a nightcap, but you declined her offer." "I really needed to speak to you, honey." I took my helmet off and looked her in the face. "Don't call me honey," I said firmly through clenched teeth. "You lost any right to do that a long time ago." I looked past her to see who it was that was with her. Was it Nicholson or some other man who was entitled to call her honey? It was dark around there and he was wearing a baseball cap. It wasn't Nicholson, who was about my height and build. This guy was taller, thinner, around 6 foot. "Who are you, pal? Take your hat off, will you?" He removed his baseball cap, saying, "It's me, Dad, Robert. I'm here to help Mom speak to you." "Is that the Robert Daniel Billings that told me he didn't want anything to do with his old man? Just a year ago," I said sarcastically. Then turning to Pat, "Is he my son?" "Pat, of course he is, you idiot." Pat spat. "How could you doubt it? I don't know how long you've been spreading your kindness around for your other lovers." "I only caught you the once," I spat back, just as venomously. "Dad," shouted Rob. Nigel, sobbed Pat, simultaneously. I went on, adding, "This is the reason why I never wanted to speak to you ever again, Pat, either of you. It's just too darn upsetting." None of you want anything to do with me, and I don't want anything to do with you, either. Why the heck don't you all just leave me alone? I was shouting by now and crying as I tried to put my helmet back on. I just wanted to get out of there. Dad, cried Robert again, and he put his arms around me and squeezed me to him. I tried to fight him, but he had pinned my arms and he was too strong, and I could feel Pat putting her arms around me too. I stopped wasting my time and strength struggling and cried my darn eyes out. I could feel another set of hands pull the helmet from my limp hands and set it on the ground, and then Evie held me from behind too. Darn it, I was flipping surrounded, and all four of us were crying by now. Families, even broken ones, still hurt, don't they? Nige, you never caught me, Honey Pat said through her own tears. It was Janet that you caught in the shower. What? Janet, I sobbed. Who the heck is Janet? Evie said. You met her earlier this evening. She asked you if you had a grudge against her. Sorry, you've lost me completely, I said. Who is she, for crying out loud? And what does all that nonsense about a grudge have to do with me? Pat chipped in then. Janet was a sales manager where I work, and she'd been having an affair with our old boss, Reggie Nicholson, for a couple of months, and, while you were at work on Friday evenings, I used to disappear into town with a couple of friends and my sister here. While they used our bedroom. What? No, that can't be right. I know your BMW was parked in our driveway. Don't try and trick me into thinking I had made a mistake. That was Janet's BMW. All three sales managers, Geoff, Janet, and me, had identical cars. I used to wait for Janet's call to say she was leaving so I could get back to the house after they had gone, and at least an hour before you got home, giving me time to change the bed linen and put the dirty ones in the wash. Evie added her input. Pat was with Pauline, Gemma, and me all evening until gone 11. She never got the call from Janet and set out for home anyway. She never drinks when she's with us, and she said she was going to surprise you all weekend starting from when you got home. Me, Gem, and Paulie are so jealous of Pat, as yours is the most solid marriage that we know. Was. Maybe. No, it's impossible. You were definitely in the shower room, Pat, until I smashed up the bed, which released the door and allowed you to get out while I was downstairs dealing with the mattress. Then you crept up behind me in the garage and surprised me. I left immediately because, I said, trying to remember a night I had spent the whole of the past year trying to forget. When Pat had come up behind me, I knew I had to get away. I had just destroyed her lover's car and smashed up her bedroom. I knew I was just a hair's breadth away from throttling the life out of her. I didn't think I could ever hurt Pat, but I was so upset and angry then that I was in the middle of a red mist. Janet didn't get herself out of the shower room. She had fainted. You had bagged up all her clothes along with mine. Her coat, purse, and car keys were still on the sofa in the living room where she left them. As soon as I got home and saw your car right up behind Janet's and blocking her in, I knew we were all in trouble. I drove further down the road and parked as there was no space left on our drive, and anyway, I wanted to leave room for you to reverse out so that Janet could get home. Then I saw the mattress lying on the lawn, the garage light on, and I knew it was a lot more serious than I'd imagined. But if it was all such a misunderstanding, why did everyone in my family tell me to bugger off? Well, Nige, that's my fault. Pat said, I couldn't tell the kids that you thought you'd caught me having an affair. I thought if you could think that badly of me so easily, that you were probably thinking of having affairs. I know now, honey, but you had just destroyed my bedroom, my carpets, ruined every stitch of clothing I possessed, including my wedding dress. I really thought we were finished that night, so did I. We were. We are. I knew from the first night we went out that I was just on borrowed time and it would all end in flames or tears one day. I was so out of your class, honey. I know I'm right on this point. It was never going to work out after the kids left. All the while you were going ever upwards in your career, and you were leaving me behind never. Then you were so much more experienced than me. I knew that when you attacked me that first date and then you took charge for our first time, so I knew you'd leave me just as soon as someone better. I was a novice. What I think that was a 3-part chorus. I attacked you that first night because I fell in love with you that very night and wanted you to be the one to take my first time then and there. And when you were reluctant to make love to me, I thought it was probably because you thought I was the innocent little girl I really was. So I lied. You lied. I lied. There's only ever been you. I've never wanted to cheat with anyone. I'm not like Janet. I only ever wanted you. I'd been thinking of making sweet love to you all that evening while Janet and Reggie were sneaking around and being unfaithful in our bed. Knowing that I didn't have to go looking for romance, I already had the real thing at home. So if it hadn't been for that darn factory fire, I might have got lucky that night and all weekend. No kids at home for once. Remember, darn, I really messed up big time going off half-cocked like that, didn't I? You did. But then I wasn't much better. I was really furious at what you did. You ruined the house, wrecked our bedroom, destroyed every stitch of clothing I possessed. And Janet was terrified, traumatized, and she's not been the same woman since. We had to let her go from her job. She couldn't work, and she couldn't cope with her divorce either. Anyway, I had to call an ambulance after you drove off and stayed there with her until she got to the hospital. The poor girl was in traumatic shock and needed sedatives. In fact, she's still on them. I couldn't stay at the house on my own that night, so I called Evie. Evie chipped in then. Pat was a mess. Her nerves were frayed. She couldn't drive to the hospital following Janet's ambulance. I had to pick her up and take her. Then from the hospital, I took her back to mine. She stayed with me for more than a week. That week was a nightmare. Pat said, Reggie came in very late to work on Monday morning with a black eye. He was late because his wife needed to use the company car to ferry the kids around. He had spent the whole weekend in a hotel apparently. His wife had been suspicious of him for a long time, and you setting fire to his car was the last straw. So she hit him over the head with a lamp and kicked him out. Then later on Monday morning, Janet's husband came into the office and beat him up badly. Janet's husband had gone to the hospital with his mom early on Saturday morning, having found a message from the hospital on his phone when he finished his night shift. His mom offered to come with him and take her clothes home for the wash. That's when he found out she had been brought in with only her coat on and nothing else. Evie took up the story. He put two and two together and confronted her. She confessed that she'd had a relationship with someone at work but refused to say who with. When her husband entered the office on Monday morning and saw Reggie's black eye plus the panic at seeing him reflected in the other eye, he made it 4. I think that's how many of his ribs he broke. Evie and Pat started laughing then. Couldn't happen to a nicer person, I said. I thought I was going to be arrested for arson. No. Pat laughed. Reggie was certain it was Janet's husband that burned his car, but nobody owned up to seeing who did it. Funny thing is that Janet's husband was a firefighter who attended both your factory fire and Reggie's car fire. But there were lots of witnesses who saw me walk away. Nobody liked that arrogant guy enough to describe you to him or the police. Though Pat laughed, his neighbors were warming their hands by the fire and were a bit annoyed when the firefighters arrived and put the blaze out. So why have you not told me that this was a mix-up until now? I didn't know anything about the fire at Grafton's for a week or so, or Reggie's car for that matter, said Pat. I was really angry with you and didn't want to speak to you, especially seeing how angry you were that night. The look in your eyes in the garage sent shivers up my spine. I actually feared for my life. I thought you'd go home and sulk while I spent a week at Evie's. Aunt Evie called us early next day and told us you and Mom had had a big argument, that you'd smashed up a few things, and that she was staying at Aunt Evie's until you cooled off. Chipped in Robert. She was clearly frightened by the violence, and we all thought the worst, that you were going through a midlife crisis and needed space apart to cool off. I'm sorry about your wedding dress, Pat. I said, I didn't notice anything in particular, just grabbed the lot, hangers and all. I didn't even know you'd kept it. I got rid of my old wedding suit years ago. I've salvaged the dress from the bags, but didn't discover it until about 10 days later. It was all wrapped up in plastic, but the oil had seeped in and stained it. I can't even clean it properly because it'll probably fall apart, sorry. So, you fixed the place up again since I asked. Evie told me about the carpets. Yes, partly at least. The police dealt with it as a domestic and gave me a crime number. I spoke to Jeannie, my friend down at the insurance brokers, and she put it through as a burglary. The nice insurance assessor man came round, and he put the cause of the claim down as aggravated burglary. So I got compensated for the bedroom furniture, the carpets, and my clothes. The check came through about 2 or 3 months later. Glad you got everything sorted out all right, then I said. By this time, we had all relaxed our grip on one another, and I was able to retrieve my helmet from the ground and fumble in my pocket for my padlock key. Yes, as I said, the adjuster came around about 10 days later, and the first time we went back to the house was on that Tuesday. Pat said, "We went round after we thought you would have left for work. I was never going back to live with you in that house, but I needed to be there for the claim adjuster to assess the damage. It was the first time I saw the extent of the bedroom wreckage in daylight and the state you left the carpets. I saw you hadn't collected any of your clothing, and neither of the spare bedrooms had been slept in." I shouted down to Evie saying I didn't think you'd been there all week, and I shouted up to her to get herself downstairs and look at the kitchen. Evie chimed in. "I saw the bunch of dead flowers, the bottle of wine, and box of chocolates on the side in the kitchen," Pat added, "and knew you must have brought them with you on Friday night, and that was why you were home so early, hoping for a romantic evening." "You know I'm an optimist," I shrugged as I unlocked my bicycle chain and wrapped it round my handlebars. "I know, so was I, but that was before I got home and saw what you'd done to the place," she said quietly. Evie said, "We then realized that you must have seen Reggie coming out the front door or getting into his car, and we thought you'd given him his black eye. We didn't know about his car being burned until months later during his divorce. That was when he heard that it was his wife that gave him the black eye after some unnamed unhappy husband was blamed for setting fire to his car. We visited Janet, who was at home heavily sedated by that Tuesday," said Pat, "and she said she never saw who it was who locked her in. She assumed her husband had found out about her affair. She finished her shower and was getting cold because the towel was now wet and my bathrobe was hanging on the bedroom door. Then she found she was trapped in there, and it was 20 minutes after she had started banging on the door and shouting for help that she then heard someone smashing up the place. The sound got louder and louder. Then you smashed the mirror and she became hysterical. Last thing she heard before she fainted was you smashing up the bed just the other side of that ensuite door. She thought it was her husband going mad with a firefighter's axe. She expected." "Nicholson's here's Johnny from the Shining film, huh?" I said as I tucked my trouser bottoms into my socks. Not the same Nicholson she'd been spending time with all night and the previous couple of months, though obviously. "No, obviously," Pat agreed. "So we tried to catch you while you were at work, and we found the place all boarded up with a for sale sign outside. We went round to your opposite number in the plate room. Tom Jolliffe's, he was at home, out of work like you at the time. He told us about that fire on the Friday night, but he thought you had stayed on until the end of the shift. Apparently the shift manager posted the list of everyone who stayed to all the interested parties. Friend of yours is he." I nodded. Pat continued, "Tom couldn't help us. He didn't know where you were. Nor would your football club mates Jonathan and Mark give up any information. Well, they're friends. I pulled the bike out of the bay and swung my right leg over the crossbar." "Where are you going?" Pat asked. "Home," I said. "Good," she said. "The girls are waiting there. They're dying to see you. That's not good. It's pretty rough round there. The car'll be up on bricks if they're parked longer than 10 minutes. "No, they are at our home. I want you to come back with me, honey. I've missed you." "I don't think so, Pat. I've become quite comfortable on my own," I lied. "You've just said you had no intention of going back to the house until you saw I had left for good." "That was before I saw the flowers and realized, and you started to make the break official with the legal separation, but that was only to get you to talk to me, honey." "Well, we're talking now." I put my foot on the pedal and wheeled down the path, calling over my shoulder, "So you can go ahead with the divorce, honey. I'm happy to sign the papers any time." I cycled off before they could say anything else. Epilogue: Pat unfroze our assets the next day. Even before I saw Evie at the copy shop that first time, Pat had known where I lived and worked. She had used a private eye to track me down and merely used Evie to open up a dialogue with me. So I wasn't that surprised when I saw that Pat was waiting at the front door when I opened the copy shop at 08:30 that Friday morning. Actually, I think I opened up 10 minutes early because it was raining outside and we don't have an awning like old-fashioned shops used to have. Apparently, she said, her office copier had packed up and she needed a couple of copies of an old report run off for some reason. "Now that we are back talking with each other, maybe we could get together to talk one evening, if you are free," Pat suggested. I was removing the wire stitches from her report and smoothing out the pages. So what subjects would we talk about one evening, for example? How the kids are getting on, what they want for Christmas, Robert's marriage plans, when we first fell in love with each other, stuff like that. There might be some things worth discussing, I suppose. When is Robert getting married, and when did you fall in love with me? I asked, knocking up the pages and fanning them into the document feeder. 2 copies, Pat, right, huh? Yeah, 2 do. She answered, raising her voice a little to overcome the noise of the document scanner. Caroline prefers the last weekend in June, but she's leaving it very late to get the right venue sorted. When you set light to that menu, when for you? I suppose we ought to sort out the actual dates first and put together a list of friends and relatives. My side of the family are pretty straightforward. Then I can run off some save-the-date postcards. I pulled the 2 copies out of the delivery tray, plus the original, and carried them over to the bench and continued. When you laughed about the burning menu, I knew I would never find anyone else quite as beautiful as you. We should have made love that first night, Pat smiled. I wanted to. I'm doing nothing tonight. Perhaps you'd meet me somewhere neutral for a drink and a chat. I wire stitched the 2 copies as well as put the original back together and carried them to the counter. Sure, I said, popping the papers into a carrier bag. Where and what time? I asked. I looked up and added, I wanted to, but was I afraid to have a relationship that was just based on physical attraction? I wanted us to get to know each other better first. Hey, how about meeting at the Charisma Lounge at 7 o'clock? She took the bag from me. Maybe you were right. We made a great team for a while. What do I owe you? 7's perfect. Yeah, I think we did for a while. No need to pay. I'm hoping we can work together again. I smiled. A new customer entered the shop, ringing the bell. I'll be right with you, sir. I'm not easily swayed. Pat tried to convince me in her fancy sales director company car Lexus, with its smoothly operating passenger door, but I resisted her advances. I knew I could wait for 3 weeks, but then she surprised me on that dark gray stair carpet. After just 3 dates in those first 3 days, using her homemade lasagna followed by sherry trifle made with sprinkles. That incredible woman can be so fascinating when she wants to be.